Lee Majors was once admired as the rugged hero every man wanted to be, and every woman adored. Farrah Fawcett was the dazzling beauty who seemed untouchable, a woman whose smile defined an entire generation. Together, they looked like the perfect Hollywood couple, unstoppable, glamorous, and forever in love. But behind the curtain, their marriage was unraveling in ways few could imagine. What began as a golden romance ended in betrayal, heartbreak, and a silence that would last decades. And now, with time stripping away the illusions, Lee Majors has finally revealed the painful truth he carried for most of his life. Long before their names were plastered across magazines and television screens, Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett were simply two ambitious young actors trying to find their way in Hollywood. Lee, born Harvey Lee Yeary in Wyandotte, Michigan in 1939, was raised in Kentucky after losing both of his parents at a young age. That tragedy instilled in him a quiet resilience, a steady determination that later translated into his acting style. His first real break came in the mid-1960s, when he landed a role on The Big Valley, starring alongside Barbara Stanwyck. From that moment, Lee Majors was no longer just another hopeful actor. He became a rising television star with a future that looked unstoppable. Farrah Fawcett's path was just as remarkable, but very different in tone. Born in 1947 in Corpus Christi, Texas, she grew up as the quintessential Southern beauty, bright, ambitious, and full of charm. She attended the University of Texas at Austin, where her looks and charisma quickly gained attention. In 1968, she moved to Los Angeles to pursue a career in modeling and acting. Her sun-kissed hair, radiant smile, and approachable personality made her a natural in front of the camera. Before long, she was appearing in commercials, print campaigns, and catching the eyes of casting directors across the city. Even before she was famous, people seemed to sense she was destined for something bigger. Their worlds collided in the late 1960s at a Hollywood party where mutual friends introduced them. The chemistry between Lee and Farrah was undeniable. He was already an established star with a calm, grounded presence. She was an aspiring actress, vivacious and brimming with energy. Where he was steady and private, she was radiant and social. Their differences made them stronger together, and it wasn't long before the two began dating seriously. Friends at the time remarked how natural they seemed. He provided stability, she brought excitement, and together they embodied the perfect balance. By 1973, they were married, sealing what many believed would be one of Hollywood's rare, lasting love stories. The timing seemed perfect. Lee had just secured the role that would define his career, Colonel Steve Austin in The $6 Million Man. The show premiered in 1973 and was an instant hit. Within a year, Majors became a household name, his image immortalized on lunchboxes, action figures, and posters. At the same time, Farrah's career was just beginning to bloom. She had secured modeling contracts, appeared in shampoo commercials, and was starting to land small acting roles. They appeared together at premieres and parties, smiling for cameras, their love story framed as one of the great Hollywood romances of the era. But even in those early years, beneath the surface of magazine-perfect photos, cracks were already forming. Hollywood was not kind to marriages, and theirs would be no exception. They were about to discover how fame, distance, and ambition could quietly dismantle even the strongest bonds, ways neither of them could have predicted. Farrah's big break came in 1976, when she was cast as Jill Monroe on Charlie's Angels. The show premiered to modest expectations, but almost overnight, it exploded into a cultural juggernaut. Farrah became the face of the franchise, the most popular angel by far, and her appeal reached far beyond the television screen. That same year, she posed for the now legendary red swimsuit poster, her smile and wind-blown hair capturing the imagination of millions. More than 12 million copies of the poster were sold, making it one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Suddenly, Farrah wasn't just famous, she was a global phenomenon. But the meteoric rise of her career came at a cost to her marriage. Lee Majors was used to grueling hours on set, but Farrah's newfound fame introduced a different kind of pressure. She was pulled in 100 different directions: magazine shoots, product endorsements, talk show appearances, and promotional tours. The sweet, down-to-earth woman from Texas was being transformed into a Hollywood brand, and with every opportunity, her time with Lee shrank further. Lee noticed the distance immediately and tried to fight against it. Friends recall how he requested adjustments in his schedule, even asking Farrah's producers if they could free up evenings for them to share simple dinners together. But Farrah reportedly resisted. She did not want to be seen as dependent on her husband's career. She wanted to stand on her own, to prove that she was more than just Lee Majors' wife. Her fierce independence, admirable in many ways, also created an emotional gap between them that neither could bridge. In interviews years later, Lee admitted that during this period, he often saw Farrah only a couple of days each week. And even those rare moments together felt rushed, sandwiched between her shoots and promotional commitments. The connection that had once been their greatest strength was slipping away. For Lee, who had always valued loyalty and stability, it was devastating. For Farrah, who was trying to seize her moment in the spotlight, it was simply the price of success. The marriage that once seemed unshakable was starting to crack under the weight of fame. And before long, those cracks would widen into a break that could never truly be repaired. By the late 1970s, Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett were still married in name, but in practice, their lives had drifted into separate worlds. He was still anchoring the $6 million man, later moving toward new projects, while she was consumed by the relentless pace of stardom. To the public, they looked like a Hollywood power couple, but in private, they were two strangers living under the same roof, speaking less and less of the same emotional language. Lee tried again and again to pull them back together. He scheduled dinners, reached out to mutual friends, and even sought small gestures to remind Farrah of the bond they once had. But Farrah's world was now orbiting in another direction. She was no longer just an actress, she was a cultural symbol, and the machine of fame left little room for compromise. The final blow came not from the distance, but from betrayal. Ryan O'Neal, an actor, a peer, and at one time a trusted friend of Lee's, entered the picture. Their paths had crossed often in Hollywood, and there had always been mutual respect. But when tabloid photos began circulating of Ryan and Farrah together, holding hands and smiling, Lee's world collapsed. She was still legally his wife, yet suddenly her romance with Ryan was everywhere. Magazine covers, late-night television jokes, and endless gossip columns. For Lee, it wasn't just the humiliation of the affair itself. It was the fact that he found out with the rest of the world, blindsided by the headlines. The man she chose wasn't a stranger, but someone he had welcomed into his circle, making the wound all the more unforgivable. Friends later said Lee felt betrayed not only as a husband, but as a man whose trust had been shattered in front of millions. Farrah never denied the relationship. She leaned into it, appearing with Ryan publicly, and the press quickly crowned them Hollywood's new golden couple. But beneath the glossy photographs was an unspoken truth. Something sacred had been broken. For Lee, there was no going back. What followed was silence. Lee never lashed out in interviews, never offered his side of the story, never publicly named his pain. He simply withdrew. The marriage ended in 1982, but emotionally it had died long before the divorce papers were signed. Farrah's new life with Ryan dominated the headlines, while Lee disappeared from her narrative entirely. It was a choice that defined him for decades. Rather than fight for public sympathy, he chose silence. But that silence would become its own heavy burden, one he carried well into his later years. When the divorce was finalized in 1982, nearly 9 years after their wedding, Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett were no longer bound by law, but the damage had been done long before. For Lee, the end of the marriage was not just a personal heartbreak. It was a public unraveling played out across headlines and tabloid covers. Yet instead of retaliating or sharing his side of the story, he chose something few in Hollywood ever manage: silence. Lee immersed himself in work. He took on roles in television movies and landed a starring part in The Fall Guy, a series that ran from 1981 to 1986. The show kept his name relevant, even if it never quite recaptured the cultural explosion of the $6 Million Man. Behind the scenes, however, friends noted that he had changed. He was still charming, still professional, but guarded. The man who once believed deeply in the permanence of love now seemed to carry invisible walls around his heart. Farrah, by contrast, leaned into her fame. Her relationship with Ryan O'Neal became a spectacle in its own right, marked by passion, volatility, and public ups and downs. They broke up, reconciled, and argued in ways that fascinated the tabloids. Farrah's career fluctuated. She sought critical acclaim with dramatic roles, sometimes winning praise, sometimes facing rejection. Yet no matter what, she remained in the public eye, her every move watched and dissected. Lee's absence from her story was striking. When Charlie's Angels had reunions, he wasn't there. When Farrah made appearances, he was never by her side. It wasn't bitterness exactly. It was self-preservation. For Lee, staying silent wasn't about pretending it hadn't happened. It was about survival. In rare interviews, when asked about Farrah, he offered polite but distant responses. He once admitted he didn't watch Charlie's Angels during its original run, not because he wasn't proud of her, but because it was simply too painful. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Lee dated but never remarried. For nearly 2 decades, he seemed to keep his personal life at arm's length. Farrah's face continued to appear on magazine covers, tied to new roles, new controversies, and always her tumultuous relationship with Ryan. Lee, meanwhile, lived in the quiet shadows of Hollywood, rarely letting the world see how deeply the betrayal had marked him. It seemed as though their stories had permanently diverged, hers loud and public, his quiet and withdrawn. Yet destiny had not finished with them, and the years of silence would eventually lead to one more turning point. By the early 2000s, decades had passed since Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett had last spoken. They had gone on to live separate lives, their marriage reduced to a bittersweet chapter in Hollywood history. Lee had grown older, softer around the edges, while Farrah, though still glamorous, was beginning to step away from the relentless spotlight. It was during this quieter time that whispers of a reunion surfaced. According to those close to them, a mutual friend approached each of them separately with the idea of meeting again. Not for the cameras, not for publicity, but simply to sit down and talk. It was meant to be private, a way to close the book on years of silence. Farrah was said to be open to it. Time had mellowed her, and she reportedly admitted to friends that despite everything, Lee had once been the great love of her life. She no longer carried the same fire for fame, and perhaps she wanted to reconcile with the man who had once grounded her. Lee, however, was less certain. He listened, he thought about it, and for a moment he seemed tempted. Friends recall that he admitted he sometimes missed the woman she used to be, the Farrah from before the whirlwind of fame consumed her. But in the end, he declined. His reasoning was simple yet heartbreaking. Too much time had passed, too much pain had been left unresolved. Seeing her again would mean reopening wounds he had worked so hard to heal. Not long after, tragedy struck. In 2006, Farrah was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. The news shocked the world. True to her nature, she faced it head-on, documenting her battle in a raw and emotional video diary that later aired as Farrah's story. It stripped away the glamour and showed her as vulnerable, brave, and human. Millions admired her strength, but for Lee Majors, the news cut deep. Despite everything, those who knew him say he followed her condition closely, grieving quietly from a distance. Yet he never reached out. He didn't visit, didn't call, didn't try to bridge the gap that had defined them for so long. For some, his silence seemed cold, but for others, it was heartbreak in its purest form, the kind that leaves someone unable to face what was lost. When Farrah passed away in June of 2009, Lee released a short, respectful statement calling her an angel on earth, and now an angel forever. But he did not attend her funeral. For him, the goodbye had already happened, years before the world knew she was sick. As the years rolled on, both Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett became symbols of a bygone era in Hollywood. Farrah's legacy was cemented not only by her unforgettable role on Charlie's Angels, but also by the courage she showed in her final battle with cancer. She became more than just a glamorous actress. She was remembered as a woman who faced unimaginable odds with dignity, honesty, and bravery. Even today, her red swimsuit poster remains iconic, while her later work is respected for the seriousness with which she approached her craft. Lee, on the other hand, moved on in his own way. After nearly 2 decades of staying unmarried, he finally found stability in 2002 when he wed Faith Majors, a woman far removed from the Hollywood spotlight. For the first time in years, he seemed to find peace. Their marriage was quieter, grounded, and untainted by the chaos of fame. Still, those close to him said the shadow of Farrah never truly disappeared. She had been his first great love, and despite the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the silence, she had also been the one who shaped his view of love forever. When asked in rare interviews about Farrah in later life, Lee never spoke with anger. Instead, he carried a tone of wistfulness, as though acknowledging that some wounds never fully heal. He admitted indirectly that he could not bring himself to watch Charlie's Angels when it first aired. It was too painful, a reminder of everything that had been lost. He also confessed that he had no regrets about staying silent after their divorce, explaining that speaking out would have only cheapened what they once had. That silence, however, was its own devastating truth. He never truly forgave her, but he also never stopped loving her. Now, at 86, the weight of time has stripped away much of the illusion. Lee Majors has finally admitted, in his own quiet way, that the story of Farrah Fawcett is the one chapter of his life that never found closure. To outsiders, it might appear as stubbornness, but to those who understand heartbreak, it is clear. Some love stories end not with shouting, but with silence. And for Lee Majors, that silence was both his shield and his greatest sorrow. Their story remains one of Hollywood's most haunting. 2 people who seemed destined for forever, undone by fame, betrayal, and the relentless march of time. In the end, the devastating truth was not that they stopped loving each other, but that they could never find their way back. Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett's story still fascinates decades later, a reminder of how fragile love can be when tested by fame and betrayal. Do you think Lee was right to stay silent all those years? Or should he have faced the past and reached out before it was too late? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories.